Good morning. I'm glad to see all of you gathered here today. Welcome to all of you that are watching online. Before we get started into the sermon, I want to personally invite you and encourage you to come tonight for the Keen's Kids program. It's going to be at 6 o'clock right here. The Best Quest is the name of it. They've worked hard and it's going to be great. You're going to be blessed if you will make the effort to be here. I promise you that. So I hope that you will. We're beginning a new sermon series today. It's going to be a 4-week series. We're simply calling it Search. And in this series, we're going to be looking for answers to some of the biggest questions that people have about God and faith. Is there a God? Why does God allow suffering and pain? Can I really trust the Bible? Is Jesus really God? And when it comes to matters of God and faith, those are some of the most common questions that cause people to just go searching for answers. But maybe Google doesn't have all the answers. Maybe we can look together at some better sources for some of those questions. So let me say right at the beginning of this series, I am not going to be able to answer all of these questions to your satisfaction. Here's my goal. My goal is to try and bring you to a place where you and God can meet. That's my goal. To bring all of us to a place where we can meet God. Our doubts and our questions do not have to lead us away from God. Although I've had plenty of friends who had some questions around these topics that we're going to be looking at, whose questions, whose doubts led them away from God. But our doubts, our questions, they don't have to do that. They can actually lead us to God. And it's important. It is important that we ask these type of hard questions for the sake of our own faith and for the sake of others. In his book, The Reason for God, Timothy Keller writes these words. He said, "A faith without some doubts is like a human body without antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or too indifferent to ask questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic." So, in this series, we're going to look at some of the biggest questions that people have about God. They're not the only questions, for sure, but they are some of the most common questions. And I hope that you'll see throughout this series how answers to these questions have helped me and countless others to believe in God more. All right, so today we're going to kick off the series with the question, is there a God? Maybe I can ask that question in a way that's a little more helpful. So here is the way that I want to frame our question for today. How can you believe in God when you can't prove God exists? That's a great question. How can you believe in God when you can't prove God exists? And it's one that we should all wrestle with, especially those of us who are Christians. So let me say what most of us already know. I cannot prove that God exists. Like beyond a shadow of a doubt, here's the proof. I wish I could. It would make my job a lot easier. But I can't prove to you that God exists. No one can. But I would also add that there's no one who can prove that God doesn't exist either. Right? Which means that both positions are positions of faith. That you have to believe something. If you can't prove God exists and you can't prove God exists, does that just leave us at an impasse? We just throw up our hands and have a really short sermon. Some of you are like, I like that idea. That's not bad. That's not a bad idea. I don't think so. I think there's more to be said. But I want to say, it takes faith to believe in God. And it takes faith to not believe that God exists. You are a person of faith if you don't believe in God. You have just placed your faith in the non-existence of God, but both positions require faith to believe. So the real question is, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you believe what you believe about the existence of God? If we believe God exists, why do you believe it? If you don't believe God exists, then why don't you believe it? And while I may not be able to give you irrefutable evidence or proof that God exists, I would submit that there is plenty of evidence. I may not be able to give you irrefutable proof, but I would submit that there is plenty of evidence that points to the existence of God. I'm actually convinced that there is more evidence to believe in the existence of God than not to believe in the existence of God. As a matter of fact, I believe that the evidence is overwhelming. It's so overwhelming that we can't look at all of it today. So I'm just going to zoom in to a couple of reasons, a couple of evidences. And in an effort to be transparent, I should point out that for every point that I'm going to be making in defense of God during this series, there are also some really smart people who would make a counterpoint against it. And that's okay. It is important that we learn to have respectful and healthy dialogues with people who disagree with us. One last thing before we get to the question at hand. If you want to go deeper in this, in search of an answer to this question, I would recommend these resources to you. The Problem of God is written by Mark Clark. Mark grew up in a atheistic home, but when his dad died, he began to take a skeptical approach to the existence of God, a search to the existence of God. He eventually became a Christian and eventually became a minister. And his work is really accessible. He's talking about his journey from skepticism into faith. Christianity for People Who Aren't Christians is written by James Emery White. Just one of the chapters in that book deal with this idea of is the existence of God, but it's the target audience for that particular book are people who aren't Christians, just like the title says, and I find it helpful for that reason. Simply Christian by N.T. Wright. He is a British thinker, one of the great minds of our generation. He has one chapter in that book, Simply Christian. He talks about the evidence for God as signposts, and he has just released a new book this year, I haven't read it yet, called Broken Signposts, where he expands that one chapter out of Simply Christian into an entire book. The classic probably that a lot of people point to in this discussion around these questions we're going to be looking at is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Keller is a minister up in New York. All right, so those are good resources if you want to search further. There's a lot of things that will show up in today's sermon out of those books, but here we go. Are you ready? To the question at hand, how can you believe in God when you can't prove God exists? Lean in, buckle up that thinking cap. This is going to be very different than most sermons that I give. The jokes are going to come few and far between, like there's ever been much humor at all. We're going to look at a lot of information by people that are a lot smarter than me in a very short amount of time, starting with the philosopher Plato, who said this: there are two things that lead men to believe in God: the existence of the soul and the order of the motion of the stars. When Plato is talking about the existence of the soul, he's talking about our morality. So two things, according to Plato, that lead people to believe in God. In today's terms, those two things have come to be called the argument of universal morality and the argument of the universe. So why do I believe in the existence of God? Well, the first reason is because of universal morality. At its most basic level, Universal morality is an inborn sense of right and wrong. Now, I'm not talking about the big issues of right and wrong here. I'm not talking about murder. I'm not talking about bank robbery or cheering for the Florida Gators. We all know those things are wrong, right? I'm talking about that inborn sense of fairness. That's not fair. It starts when we are children. It's my turn to swing on the swing set. You've already had a turn. Or, hey, that person cut in line. Or, hey, that's my seat. You can't sit in that seat. That's my seat. This inborn sense of fairness, that there is a right and that there is a wrong. And it only gets magnified as the issues get bigger. If anyone hears the story of a child that is being molested, or a child that is sold into slavery, or the story of a wife that's being abused by her husband, or the story of a murder, right? The story of a man who goes into a convenience store or supermarket in Buffalo yesterday, opens fire. We hear that kind of stuff. We know there's something wrong about that. That's not right. Inside of every human being is this inherent moral code. And even if we don't personally follow it, we feel that on the inside. We know that we're doing something wrong. In 2019, there was a team of anthropologists from Oxford University who conducted the largest cross-cultural survey on morality that's ever been done. They studied the moral guidelines of 60 different cultures around the world. And what they discovered from that survey is this, quote, "Everyone, everywhere shares a common moral code." Specifically, the Oxford study demonstrated that there are 7 moral rules that appear to be universal across all cultures. I don't have time to go into those 7 rules, but the question is, how does that happen? Like, where did that moral code come from? And when did we all agree to it? I never voted on 7 rules. Did you? So how did we get there? How did we get to the point where there are certain moral rules, that there's a moral code that is shared by all people everywhere? Could it be that it was placed there by God? Now, I know, of course, that some people will push back and claim to believe in moral relativism, that morals are not universal, that they are just a matter of personal preference or the place where you grew up. But I will guarantee you that this belief system, and it is a belief system, breaks down quickly when it gets personal. If you attack one of the values that is held by moral relativists, then you will see how quickly they abandon that belief system. If you say, I think prejudice is okay, I think racism is a good idea, I think exploiting children is fine, then you will see that they don't think those things are just personal preferences. In reality, even a person who argues for moral relativism believes that there are some things that are morally wrong in spite of individual preferences. And some people will push back even further. And they will say, well, this internal moral law is not really evidence for God. It's evidence of the byproduct of our evolutionary development and the social construct in which we were raised. But the problem with that is this. The evolutionary theory, at its core, is based on survival of the fittest. The foundation of evolutionary thought is that only the strong survive. Kill or be killed. Steal or be stolen from. Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary thinking, wrote these words in 1871 in his book, The Descent of Man. listen to evolutionary thinking and where it leads. He wrote, unfavored races, the mentally challenged, those who have any potential to pass along any sickness or disease should not be allowed to reproduce because they will hinder our progress as a species. He goes on. Both sexes ought to refrain from marriage if they are in any marked degree inferior in body and mind. True evolutionary thinking without God as a part of it would only lead to sexism and racism and slavery and unequal treatment of the sick and the poor and the marginalized, because its end goal is to wipe out the weak and promote a survival of the fittest. But we don't celebrate those things as right and good the way evolutionary thinking would require us to do. Instead, we are repulsed by those things, aren't we? We are, and this isn't about Christians who are repulsed by this. Most people are repulsed by the end result of this kind of thinking. Could it be that something has been hardwired into us by somebody else? I can't prove to you that God exists. I wish I could. But perhaps I can bring you to a place where the two of you can meet. And one of those places is at the intersection of our life and this universal morality that exists within all of us, that draws us to be better. We have this innate desire to be good, to be caring, to be loving, to be kind, generous people. And even when we are not living that way, we are still pulled toward it. Where does that come from? The Apostle Paul wrote this a long time ago in Romans 2:14 and 15. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. What Paul is saying is that people who don't know God's law still know right from wrong by their very nature. The requirements of the law, do not murder, do not steal, are written on their hearts. What or who writes this moral code on our hearts to be able to discern between what is right and wrong? This is evidence that points to the existence of God. For me, if there is no God, I don't believe universal morality could exist. I don't believe it would exist. I don't believe it could exist. Because if there is no God, we would all naturally just look out for ourselves. And we would celebrate others who do the same. But that's not the way we live. That's not the way we live as people. So why do I believe in God when I can't prove that God exists? One reason is because of a universal morality. The second most compelling reason for me is because of the universe. It's because of the universe. Take a deep breath. This is only halftime. And if you think you've had to buckle up the thinking cap, we're about to go all scientific, y'all. So take a breath. There are some people who believe that science and faith are at odds. But it seems to me that science and faith are the perfect marriage. There are plenty of brilliant scientists and philosophers and educators who believe in God. World-renowned physicist Albert Einstein once said, "Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble. Some of the most compelling evidence for the existence of God comes from the universe in which we live. How did the universe get started? Why is there something rather than nothing? Up until 1929, atheist scientists believed that the primary proof for the non-existence of God was the universe itself, because, in their estimation, the universe had always existed. The universe, they believed, was the only eternal thing in existence. And their own theory said that if something has a beginning, then something outside of that thing, something that pre-existed, had to cause it to come into existence. If something had a beginning, something had to cause that beginning. But since the universe was eternal, there was no need for God because the universe had always existed. But in 1929, that changed when Edward Hubble made a discovery that the universe itself had a beginning. When Hubble looked through his telescope, he discovered that the galaxies were moving away from each other at a rapid rate, which meant that the universe is still expanding. As a result of Hubble's discovery, physicists began to speculate that in the beginning, all the matter of the universe was compressed into a point of infinite density, which is spoken of as the singularity. And then something caused the matter to explode, which was the beginning of the universe. Of course, we have come to know this theory as the Big Bang Theory. Did you know that many of the first people to reject Hubble's discovery were not Christians, but were atheist scientists? Do you know why? It's because if his discovery was true, it was evidence that the universe had a beginning, which meant, according to their own theory, that something or someone that pre-existed outside of the universe had to cause it to come into existence. And here's the relevant question. Could that force have been God? Francis Collins, a physician at Bethesda, Maryland, brilliant mind, leads the Human Genome Project and is also a fully devoted follower of Jesus. And he writes these words: "The Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of time and space could have done that." In a moment of honesty, the late world-renowned atheist scientist Stephen Hawking said this: "The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications." Hello. The odds are enormous, in Hawking's own words. Well, they have determined the odds. People a lot smarter than me, they figured out the odds that a universe like ours can come out of a random explosion. The odds are 1 in 10 to the 138th power. You don't seem impressed. 1 in 10 to the 138th power. It's because it's a number that our minds can't even comprehend. To give it a little bit of context, still not all that helpful, the number of atoms that are in the entire universe are 1 in 10, or not 1 in 10. The number of atoms in the entire universe are 10 to the 70th power. The number of atoms in the entire universe, 10 to the 70th power. The odds of a universe like ours coming out of a random explosion are 1 in 10 to the 138th power. It's amazing to me that the Big Bang, in essence, describes what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years. The very first verse of the Bible reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The Bible never tries to prove God. It assumes that God exists. And let me just say to those of us who are Christians, when you get into a conversation with someone about the existence of God, you can't say, well, the proof is right there in the Bible. For two reasons. One, they don't believe the Bible as a source of proof. And the Bible itself never tries to prove God's existence. The Bible just assumes that God exists. And that eternal God who's always existed spoke into the nothing and created everything. That's the way the book begins. But wait, there's more. That sounds like an infomercial. But wait, there's more. There's more because we haven't even mentioned the evidence of design. So Tim Keller calls the evidence of design the cosmic welcome mat. The cosmic welcome mat refers to a principle that physicists, and either secular or religious, doesn't matter, physicists have come to call it the anthropic principle. Anthropic is a word meaning human. So this principle recognizes that the universe seems fine-tuned to be the kind of place that can support humanity, that can support life. That's what this cosmic welcome mat ideal is. I have read that there are about 120 variables, and even if one of them are not exact, we would not exist. For example, if the oxygen level wasn't exactly 21%, or if the moon wasn't just the right distance to keep the earth tilted on its axis at 23.5 degrees, or if the length of a rotation of the earth was any more or any less than it is, our planet could not sustain life. In fact, physicists say that we live in the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And scientists have discovered in recent decades, in ways that previous centuries could not have imagined, that the universe looks strangely like it was designed precisely so that we could exist. The relevant question then is, how do we explain such a precise design? For those who don't believe in the existence of God, the most common theory, and there have been all kinds of theories, right? Aliens, as one of the more common theories for a while, but presently, the most common theory among those who don't believe in the existence of God, to explain the precise design of our universe and our world, is the multiverse theory. Multiverse, that's right. The multiverse is not just for Marvel movies. The multiverse is the idea that our universe is one of an infinite number of universes, and that surely among all those infinite number of universes, one's going to get lucky, and we are the lucky one. The lucky one that's capable of hosting life as we know it. Do you know what it takes to believe a theory such as the multiverse with little to no evidence to support it? It takes faith. I would suggest it takes a step of blind faith. The other option, of course, is that the universe's design is so precise because there's a designer. Owen Gingerich is the professor of astronomy at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. These dudes are so smart, I had to practice pronouncing where they work. And Owen Gingerich said this: there are so many wonderful details which, if they were changed only slightly, would make it impossible for us to be here. One has to feel somehow that there is a design in the universe, and therefore a designer to have worked it out so magnificently. That's the professor of astronomy at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. I don't even know what that means. So let's bring it down to a level that even I can understand. Someone else has said this. It's one thing to see a log jam like the one that you see on the screen and wonder, was that built by a beaver or did that just happen? But it's another thing altogether to look at the Hoover Dam and wonder, did that just happen randomly by an explosion, or was there a designer behind it? No one looks at the Hoover Dam and thinks that just happened by accident. It's obvious that there's a designer, that there's a builder behind it. So why then, when we look at the complexity of our universe, is it not obvious that there's a designer and builder behind it? The Bible confirms what seems so obvious by observation, that the creation points to God. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Our universe is screaming to humanity, there is a God. There is a God. A God who so intimately cares for you and uniquely designed and created you. Friends, I would argue, in light of the limited evidence I presented today and the so much more that I haven't covered, that it requires more faith to believe that God doesn't exist than to believe in the existence of God. So what are our options? As I see it, there are only two. Either you believe that God is real or you don't. Those are the only two options. And if you do believe in God, it's not going to take away all of your questions. As a matter of fact, it will probably bring up more questions like the ones that we're going to look at over the next few weeks. And I hope you'll make it a point to be here. How can God, if God exists, allow the kind of suffering and evil that exists in our world? Can I trust the Bible? Is it reliable? Is it a reliable source for knowing this God? And I didn't get to it today because we're going to get to it in 3 weeks. The most compelling evidence for me that there is a God who exists is the person of Jesus. Is Jesus really God? Believing in God doesn't remove all your questions. It doesn't remove all your doubts, but it's a starting point because a relationship with God starts with believing in God. Hebrews 11:6. And without faith, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So what will you do with God? You are a person of faith. The question is, where do you put your faith? I have put my faith in a God who has designed this world for us to live. I believe in a God who loves us so much that not only did he create all of this for us to exist, but who gave his only son to say, I love you. To reveal, not only through creation, but through a person, the heart of God. For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. Where do you put your faith? I believe in the existence of God. But what will you do with God? I can't prove he exists. You can't prove he doesn't exist. But I hope you have come to a place where the two of you can meet. And if you want to talk more about that, then as we sing this song, I'm going to invite you to come to that Connect Center in the back so we can have a conversation. There'll be people glad to talk with you and pray with you. But for right now, let's pray together. God, there are some of us here this morning who want and need to know you in a much deeper way. We give you thanks that you've not left us to try and figure out by our own strength, by our own effort, by the strength of our own intellect, that you haven't just left us to figure out who you are on our own, but you have revealed yourself in so many ways. You have revealed yourself through creation. You have revealed yourself by giving us a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And you have revealed yourself ultimately through the person of Jesus. And you have revealed yourself as a personal, holy, compassionate God. And if we have never done more than just regard you with an intellectual curiosity, then we want today to be a new beginning. Please come into our lives right now as never before. We thank you for Jesus, who came into this world to be the very best evidence that you are real and that you are a God who loves your creation, including each one of us. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.